Today I want to tell you about a man that I used to work with. His name was Ian Turvill, and for several years during my time at the Chicago-based law firm of Freeborn and Peters, Ian's office and my office shared a wall. Ian, during his time at the firm, was our chief marketing officer, and before we get into this episode further, I want each of you to understand what kind of person Ian was, because I think it matters for everything that we're going to discuss here later and when you meet our guest. Ian was incredibly kind. He was genuinely kind. Not the professional version of kind where someone is pleasant in meetings and disappears afterwards. The real version. The version where you'd walk past Ian's office and he would just call you in to talk. Not about work, but about your life. About your weekend, about a movie he just saw because he knows you love movies, or about something funny that had happened that morning. And he had a fantastic sense of humor. That kind of sense of humor that made you feel like you were in on the joke and not the target of it. He made people feel comfortable. He made people feel seen. And in a law firm where the culture can be intense and hierarchical and sometimes cold, Ian was a warm room. I didn't know everything that Ian was carrying when we worked together. I don't think most of us that worked at Freeborn and Peters did. Because the thing about people who make everybody feel comfortable is that they're often doing it at their own expense. They're managing the temperature of every room that they go into in ways that I've talked about on this podcast before. And in my experience, the people who are the best at managing everybody else's experience are sometimes the worst at managing their own. In 2017, Ian took his own life, and it shook our firm. It shook me. It really shook everybody who knew him, because the man that we saw, the kind man, the funny man, the man who always had enough time for you, was carrying something that none of us could see. And the weight of it was more than he could bear. So today's episode is not about that loss, although we will honor Ian and his life. Actually, today's episode is about what comes after that loss, because Ian has a daughter named Claire, and Claire has spent the years since her father's death doing something that I think would have made him incredibly proud. She has been learning to listen to herself, and in doing that, to trust her own voice. Part of that has been being able to make decisions based on what feels right rather than what looks right to everyone else. And in doing so, Claire has built a life that is hers, authentically courageous and on her own terms. My guest today, Claire Turvill, is a yoga teacher. She is a mentor and she is an entrepreneur. And recently she reached out to me because she wanted to make a case on this show. And the case she wants to make is one that I think is deeply personal to her. It's also deeply connected to her father's story, and I think deeply relevant to anyone who has ever made a decision because of how it would look rather than how it would feel. That's why when we come back, I'm going to welcome Claire to the podcast, and we will listen as she makes the case for listening to your gut. Welcome back to The Case For. I'm your host, Matt Campobasso, and today's episode is one that means a great deal to me personally. As I mentioned earlier, my guest today is Claire Turvill. Claire's father, Ian, and I worked together at Freeborn and Peters in Chicago about 10 years ago. Claire reached out to me to make a case that I think carries a weight and an honesty that this show doesn't always get to hold. Claire, first, I want to say thank you so much for being here, and in being here, thank you for trusting me with this conversation.
Hi, Matt. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity, and it's really nice to hear you talk about my dad in a way that I, frankly, have not experienced in many years, and brings him to life in a new way for me.
Well, it's my pleasure. So, Claire, before we get to the case that you're here to make today, I want to do something that I think is very important. I want to talk about your dad for a minute, because obviously, you knew him as your dad. I knew your dad as a colleague for many years. But some of the people who are listening don't know your dad. They didn't have the opportunity to get to know him. And I think they should. So I worked with your dad for several years. And what I remember most is not anything professional, although he was very good at his job and took it very seriously. But your dad had this way of making people feel comfortable. He was warm. He was genuinely funny. it wasn't performative. Like, it was actually funny. I consider myself a funny person, and I think your dad was one of those people who would always catch me off guard. So I think that's something that I want to make sure that we honor enough today, which is just his sense of humor and his ability to be humorous, but in an unexpected way. Your dad also had this ability to make you feel as though the conversation you were having with him was the most important thing happening in his day, even when you knew that it wasn't. He was incredibly generous with his time, professionally and personally, and he was generous with his attention. And in a profession like the law, which doesn't always reward those things, your dad did them anyway, because that's who he was. So, Claire, that's my limited version of who your dad was in an office setting, but obviously you knew him in a way that I never could. So tell us, who was your dad to you, and what do you want people to know about the man behind the title?
Well, the first thing that everyone should know about my dad is that he's British. He grew up in Bexley, Kent, and moved to the US in 1993 when he was 23. So all of that great humor that you experienced that so many people loved about him was the classic British humor, sarcasm, and wit, anything that one could imagine, which as a result, my brother and I developed an incredibly inappropriate sense of humor as well from a very young age. I could probably start quoting Austin Powers by the time I was 5. My dad was incredibly smart and multi-passionate. He did everything that he could to set his kids up for success, from painstakingly helping me learn how to effectively outline an essay for high school English class to absolutely hot rodding a Pinewood Derby car for my brother's Cub Scouts. He loved music. He was a drummer and played in a jazz band in his younger years. We shared a love of musical theater. He famously portrayed the modern Major General in Pirates of Penzance when he was in grammar school, which, in classic dad fashion, he always claimed he got that role by practicing the challenging solo on his walk to and from school every day, which was, of course, uphill both ways and in the snow. I'll remind everyone that this was England, so maybe the truth is a little stretched there. He was huge on Google and would probably be obsessed with ChatGPT, but horrified to learn that we've lost credibility with the Oxford comma. He truly was someone to look up to, and for what it's worth, a decent role model. He exemplified the benefits of hard work and genuinely cared about the success of everyone around him, not just himself.
Claire, thank you. I have 3 kids of my own, and if someday they describe me with half of that, I will be very happy. None of that surprises me, knowing your dad. He had an incredibly dry and sarcastic sense of humor. But I feel like with a lot of people who are sarcastic and have a sharp wit, they can be cruel. I never found your dad to be that way. I think it was self-deprecation sometimes, or observational. Hearing all of that, including the Pirates of Penzance, I feel like I remember him telling me that story, and perhaps maybe even showing me a clip of the performance at some point, which is your dad to a T. So, Claire, one of the things that I think is going to make this conversation so important is that your dad was, by every outward measure, a very good man. He was kind, he was successful, but he was also a man who was struggling in ways that most of the people around him didn't see. And I think that's something that a lot of people listening will recognize, either in someone they've lost or in themselves. The idea that a person who makes everyone else feel okay is sometimes that person who is least okay.
Many people are very good at masking what's really going on inside their heads, whether through humor or self-deprecation or other things to portray a united front. While, as I said, my dad exemplified the benefits of hard work, his drive for success was really a need for external validation and a fear of failure. He lacked any real sense of self-worth or self-confidence. In addition to his anxiety and depression, he had type 2 diabetes. All of this he saw as a type of failure. especially since he struggled to manage it all. He was terrified of what you and his other colleagues and leaders would think of him if they knew how much he was balancing, because if they knew, maybe he wouldn't be seen as capable and intelligent and confident, or in some other negative light that would impact his position. He barely opened up to anyone about his reality. Only my mom and I knew. Not even his parents or his brother knew the extent of it until his death. He kept it all hidden because to him, admitting that he needed help was failure, which, as his daughter, is still a difficult truth for me to shoulder, that he was so stuck in needing to be enough for everyone else that he forgot how to be enough for himself.
Before we get on to the opening statement portion of the episode, I want to say, Claire, thank you for being vulnerable and authentic and sharing that. While I knew your dad professionally, and I'd like to think that we became, friends through work, I didn't know that about him. And, obviously here we are 9 years later, and there's nothing that anyone can do to change the past. But I think about where I was at that time, and some of the things that you're describing that your dad struggled with, I've struggled with in my life. I'm 48 years old. I don't know many lawyers or legal professionals who aren't struggling with some degree of anxiety or depression. It's a very demanding industry. But to your dad's balance of not wanting to appear outwardly like he couldn't manage things because he was concerned that those might be cracks that are viewed as against him. Like, I could completely understand that. And, I think about what he was juggling or managing and trying to balance back then. And I just wish he had felt comfortable talking to me about those things, because I think the first thing I would have said to him was, hey, I'm right there with you, right? I have different struggles, but, your dad was with the firm a few years less than I was, but I can tell you, I got to know a lot of the lawyers that worked there, and everybody had their crosses to bear. But it's hard to think about that, because I think when you do struggle with some of the things your dad carried, you're just thinking about how you're perceived.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have that ability to zoom out and think everybody has things that they're struggling with. And he's so close to it, and he's trying to be a dad and a husband and a chief marketing officer and a human being and a son and a brother. And, you said a lot about that needing that outside validation. That's something I struggle with. And I've tried to get better with that as I've gotten older. But it's definitely a very challenging struggle. And when you're always looking to the outside world to tell you what you're worth, the outside world's not always paying attention to you. And so when it goes quiet or something bad happens, it can really have a negative effect. And so we're here today to talk about your dad and to talk about you, but I couldn't let this moment pass and at least say, like, I can completely relate to and understand what your dad struggled with. And I'm really happy that, amongst all the sadness, that you were able to find so many positive lessons. I know there's still things that you're, I'm sure, navigating and will for the rest of your life, but the fact that you've taken the last 9 years and reflected and grown in ways we're going to talk about here today is so impressive. And I have no doubt your dad is very proud of you. So with that, let's talk about the case that you're here to make today. And then I want you to tell it in your own words, because this is your case. I'm here to kind of facilitate the conversation. Obviously, this isn't a real courtroom, so there's no rules of procedure. But, as a lawyer with almost 20 years of experience, I have a little bit of familiarity with this process, and I think it might be a good way to work our way through your case. So, as a lawyer, Claire, so much of what I do and what other lawyers do is based on evidence and analysis and logic. That's the training that you get in law school. And you look at the facts, you assess risks, you choose the path that gives your client the best outcome. And that framework has served me incredibly well professionally, but it has also taught me over time to distrust the other signals in my life, the other ones that don't come from analysis. The signal that comes from deeper. When your body is saying, hey, this is right, or something is wrong here. I think a lot of people call that like their gut instinct. And, sometimes having a logical brain that has helped me be an effective lawyer for 20 years has forced me to override my gut really more times than I can count. I've taken jobs that have looked perfect on paper when something inside of me said, hey, maybe this isn't the right fit. I've stayed in friendships, relationships longer than I should have because the logic said stay when everything in my body was like, you're not happy or this isn't good for you. And I've made decisions that have impressed the people in the room, but at the expense of kind of hollowing me out. And I think most professionals, most adults have done the same thing because we're all trained to trust the data in the spreadsheet over the signal and the optics. How does this look to the world versus what am I telling myself that I need? And I think ultimately you boil that down to we are programmed for the most part to think about the way that something looks rather than the way that something feels. And so, Claire, as we talked about in advance and in preparation for you being here today, your case is a little bit touching on what that training costs us and that our gut, our intuition, our inner voice, whatever you want to call it, is not a vague feeling that can be dismissed or that should be dismissed. It's information. It's your nervous system telling you that something your conscious mind hasn't caught up with yet needs to be considered and sat with. And so learning to listen to your gut is not soft. It's not mystical. It's actually one of the most practical, most powerful skills a person can develop. And so with that, I want to hand the mic over to you and tell us in your own words, what's the case that you're here to make today?
I love that you mentioned training because one of my mentors calls the balance between logic and intuition your training versus your truth. We spend, as you mentioned, much of our lives being trained by parents, by teachers, social standards, jobs. This is often how we determine our values because it was valuable to someone before us, and they taught us that it should be valuable to us as well. And it's in following your training that we generally tend to make the decisions that look good. Your truth, your gut, your intuition, the inner voice is who you truly are beneath all of that training. When you peel back the layers to find what is true for you, these are the decisions that feel good and are aligned with who you are. In my own experience, you can get pretty far doing the things that look good. Succeeding in school, going to a good college, getting an impressive degree, rising the ranks of the corporate ladder. And for some people, this path may be perfectly suited to who they are. For my dad and subsequently for me, doing the things that looked good did produce a lot of success, but also completely sacrificed our happiness, our confidence, and our self-worth. So the case I'm here to make today is that if you are someone who has spent years doing what you thought was right, chasing success based on what others told you to do, what would make others happy, or what looks good, but you continue to find yourself unfulfilled or lacking confidence or imagining the ways that your life could be better, it's time to change your approach. It's time to learn how to listen to your gut and to start doing what feels good.
Thank you, Claire. So something that you shared with me, obviously you and I exchanged some emails in advance of recording today's episode, but something that you shared with me in one of those emails, I haven't really been able to stop thinking about. And you said it was something that your dad used to say to you. He would say, you know, you've done well when you've impressed me, and I'm not easily impressed. And you told me that after every concert, every play, every soccer game, what you really wanted to hear from him was two words: I'm impressed. Can you talk about what that conditioning and what that pattern did to you over time?
hmm I got such a rush from impressing my dad. As a younger person, the idea that my dad was not easily impressed, and yet I, at 15, impressed him with my violin solo. I must be some prodigal, amazing child who has it all figured out. So this did two things. It pushed me to perform for the sake of impressing him, and it took away any internalized sense of self-worth or confidence. Because you don't learn to develop these things if the praise is always coming from an external source. He wasn't knowingly training me to place my value in the opinions of others. It wasn't malicious parenting to trick me into being better. It was his own flaws and his training showing up. Over time, and especially after his death, when such a direct source of external validation disappeared, my already existing need to seek attention got worse. I look back now and can understand the way I used to act was completely inauthentic and driven by what I thought would impress other people. This also led me to develop severe resentment for the life I was living because I ended up living a life shaped by what I thought would make others happy or make me likable.
So, Claire, I want to take a second and focus on something you just said, which was your dad wasn't doing this maliciously. He wasn't trying to harm you. I think even someone listening who didn't know your dad would imagine that was likely the case. Your dad was passing along a pattern that he himself struggled with, and obviously in his own case more severely than perhaps the average person. Can you talk about that for a minute? Because I think this is one of the most important things we're going to touch on in this conversation, which is the idea that people who shape us are often giving us the best they have, and sometimes the best they have includes their own wounds.
I want to come back to a minute for the fact that my dad was British, because he was raised by two parents who lived through World War II at very young ages. And what was the motto of World War II in Britain? Keep calm and carry on, which my grandparents embodied to a T. While not something I entirely experienced from them, it's my understanding that my dad's childhood experience was there's no complaining, life is what it is, you work hard and you succeed. To put that in the context of his own struggle with mental illness and his health, that's part of why he didn't open up to people. Showing emotion isn't a strength. You must be stoic and carry on. To live with this mentality for your whole life, you're probably going to pass it on to your kids, knowingly or not, which is to say, he was trained by his parents, just as my brother and I were trained by him and our mom. It takes a certain type of person to recognize and to change the pattern of training that is passed down through generations. He taught us his understanding of what success meant. Despite so many valuable lessons, including how to ask useful questions, how to Google if you can't get the answer, how to make professional connections, and how to make yourself stand out from the crowd, the flaw was that his definition of success was you are only as successful as other people can view you to be. And that is all tied up in how you present yourself, from wit to resourcefulness to stoicism.
So two things, Claire. Number one, and maybe you knew this, I have a distinct memory. As I mentioned earlier, Dad and I sat next to each other. I think the entire time he was with the firm, multiple years, his office was right next to mine. And so if he was going towards a conference room or the bathroom, or I was going to the copier, we would walk by each other's offices. And I do recall him being someone whose door was always open. I think it was an extension of how warm and inviting he was. But on the outside of the door, some people at the firm would hang something, a picture or a printout. And your dad had the very famous keep calm and carry on cut out and taped to his door. And I always saw it and I thought, oh, he's British. Of course, that's their thing. But listening to you talk just now about that being the way that he was raised, understanding, the circumstances of World War II, it just gives another level of texture to all the times I walked by that and just kind of, nodded my head and thought, oh yeah, Ian's British. Of course he has that on his door. The other things you were talking about is I think about those things in my own life. I'm an oldest child. I internalized a lot of similar patterns that your description of your dad, they really resonate with me. My sense of worth was tied to competence, to achievement, to the approval of people around me. And I've worked really hard the last few years trying to untangle that. I just turned 48, and I would say, better late than never, but right around 44 is when I was like, you know what? I've got some patterns here that I need to be more aware of and do something about. trying to figure out which of the decisions that I was making were mine and which were performances for audiences that I didn't even realize I was playing to. Personal relationships, professional relationships. Your dad and I just said a moment ago shared that wall, and I wonder now how much he and I shared in terms of that internal pressure. Because there is a pressure. It's not unique to law firms, but there's a pressure to look like you have it together as you get older and to make decisions that impress people, especially when you get to the level that your dad was at. He was the chief marketing officer for a really successful and notable firm in the city. So next, Claire, I want to talk about Exhibit B, which I will call the two realities. You described something in your notes to me that I thought was really powerful. You talked about this feeling of existing between two realities, the reality of what you've done for other people that was supposed to make you happy, and the reality of what would actually make you happy. And you said it creates an almost dysmorphic feeling. Can you unpack that for the listeners? Because I think there's probably a lot of people here who are listening who are living in some version of that gap right now, and they don't have the language to verbalize it.
That feeling to me is the biggest red flag you can have, that your nervous system, your body is sending up signals that you are not where you are supposed to be. You have your mind set on something, but every internal instinct is telling you this is not right. To give an example, after college, I moved to Hoboken, New Jersey to follow my then boyfriend. I never wanted to live anywhere close to New York City. I don't do well with crowds. I don't do well with excess noise, not to mention the sky-high costs. But I did it anyway because it would make my ex-boyfriend happy, and because the fear of not going, being alone, and not knowing what would happen felt worse than the discomfort of choosing to move somewhere I didn't really want to be, but would have some certainty in my future. You'd expect that living in Hoboken, working in New York City in your mid-20s would be exciting. I had a boyfriend who maybe someday would want to move in with me. We had a large friend group and would go out almost every weekend. I got coffee at Ralph's every day at work and went on beautiful walks along the Hudson River. These are all things that look on the outside amazing. Yet for those 3.5 years, I lived somewhere that constantly set my nervous system on edge. I quite literally felt unsafe, from too noisy neighbors, to difficult parking, to the unpredictable damage from flooding, to a boyfriend who could not love the authentic version of me. That's where the dissonance starts. For 3.5 years, instead of finding joy in a walkable city with close friends and public transit, every day I was fighting with things outside of my control and placing all of the blame for my unhappiness on those things, which is where you get the dysmorphic feeling, the victim mentality. You know that you're not where you want to be. Your body is physically responding negatively to the situation, yet you haven't accepted that you have more control and responsibility over what's happening than you're willing to admit. Instead, all energy goes to blaming the things that are causing you discomfort and telling yourself that maybe one day something will change and then you'll be happy, but for now, I'm stuck here.
Claire, I want to connect with something here because I think it's the heart of the case that you're making. You're describing that dissonance, the gap between how things look and how they feel. And you're saying that the feeling of wrongness, or that delta, is actually information. It's your body or your gut, your nervous system. It's raising a red flag. And the question is whether you listen to it or whether you override it. Your dad, as you've described, he overrode it for a long time. And the cost of that was devastating. You, at some point, started listening. So tell us about what that turning point was for you.
I started listening when I realized that I was sacrificing who I am for who I thought I should be. whether because I was doing what I thought was right or because I'd made choices to make others happy. When I finally accepted that I was living in that victim mentality, and as much as I may have wanted to believe otherwise, my unhappiness was not the fault of my ex-boyfriend or the fault of people who would drive by my apartment at 2 a.m. blasting music or the fault of the street cleaning schedule. My unhappiness was entirely due to my choice to stay in that relationship where I never felt good enough and to stay in a living situation that did not meet my basic or psychological needs. For me personally, I started working with a spiritual technology that helped me to better understand alignment and embodiment. Suddenly, I began to see decision making through a very different lens. When someone is operating in a victim mentality and external referencing, as I was, as my dad did, and acting for the approval of others, it draws us out of ourselves. We lose connection to intuition because we bypass it by blaming everything outside of ourselves for our situation, all while acting for the sake of outward validation. Learning to not only listen to my gut, but to trust in the messages that I was receiving was like I was actually seeing myself for the first time. And that for the first time in 25 years, I actually felt like I was in control and knew who I was.
That's incredible. Just your story, your experience and navigating those feelings and the turning point of saying, "Hey, you know what? I'm in this situation by choice." And I think it'd be a good time to get practical, because I think if people are listening, they hear listen to your gut and they think, well, that sounds abstract. What does that mean to me or for me? It sounds like something you'd read on a t-shirt or a bumper sticker, but you've built an entire practice around this. As we mentioned earlier, you teach yoga, embodiment, and tools that help people get connected to what their body is telling them. So walk us through that. When you say listen to your gut, what does that actually mean in practice? What does it feel like when your gut is saying yes versus when it's saying no? And how does somebody who's been ignoring that signal for 20 years start listening to it again?
Unfortunately, depending on how in tune you already are with your body, it is an abstract idea. That's why many people, myself included, spend years bypassing intuition until we actually learn what those feelings are. For me, my gut instinct shows up calmly. In my experience, it wasn't like I woke up one morning and had some huge life-changing revelation. It was as if I had finally put together the pieces of a puzzle I'd been working on, and suddenly it all clicked and the image was complete. For the question of yes versus no, I've had to practice being patient, which for anyone who knows me is not historically easy for me. To allow myself to sit with options and see what comes to fruition. This doesn't mean sitting and doing nothing. To use the puzzle analogy, you're actively working on the puzzle, but if you are looking for a specific piece, you're not going to just pick up the next one you see and try to force it to fit. You're actively looking, but you're waiting for the right one to appear. It's a patient process. But then once you find it, you know it's going to fit. When the answer is no, it feels like all of my attempts to make it a yes are very forced. Compared to when the answer is yes, almost miraculously, everything just seems to fall into place. For anyone who feels like they've been bypassing intuition, I'm going to recommend two things. The first is focus on the feeling behind your decisions. By feeling, I mean the sensations, not necessarily the emotions. You are looking for calm, grounded, assured feelings, not rushing or forcing. The second thing is get comfortable being uncomfortable. If you've not trusted your gut decisions before, doing so can be very scary. Trusting that your intuition, that your body knows what you need when you've spent so long relying on logic or the opinions of others can be uncomfortable. But the more you learn to accept what the feeling of your intuition really is, to make decisions from gut instinct, the more you will come to trust yourself to make decisions that are right for you.
So I want to ask something from my own experience because I think it's relevant to the discussion we're having. As a lawyer, I live in my head. Analysis, logic, evidence. That unfortunately, while it pays the bills professionally, it's also seeped into who I am personally. I see a therapist regularly just to talk through life. And I think he's been in practice for like 30 years. And he routinely tells me, I've never had a patient who overthinks things. So logically, which at first I heard that I was like, oh, that's good, right? And over time I've realized, no, that's in fact actually the opposite. So, my entire training as a lawyer has been about making decisions from what I would call the neck up. And I've realized over the last few years that some of the worst decisions that I've ever made were the ones where my analysis said yes, but my body said no. The logic was sound, right? It looked good on paper. The spreadsheet checked out, but something in my chest or my stomach was saying, hey, this isn't right. And more often than not, I ignored it because I didn't know how to value information that didn't come in the form of evidence. Is that something that you see in the people that you work with, people who are so trained to think that their way through decisions is the only way, and then as a result, they've lost access to feeling their way through things?
I love to tell my clients to get out of their head, to throw logic and reason out the window because gut instinct is not a logical process. And self-awareness can be a really useful tool. It can also be a boon because thinking through decisions is the default. It's how our society runs and it's where external referencing shows up. So, depending on how you've used self-awareness in the past, you saying that you're overthinking your therapy sessions, that's just thinking. That's more thinking. That's not using self-awareness to tap into the intuitive feeling. And it is especially prevalent in the professional world. As a lawyer, if you were to walk into the courtroom tomorrow and make an argument to the jury based on a gut feeling, they're not going to take you seriously. My partner is an architect. His work revolves around conforming to performance standards and building codes. This is the way our world runs. We're taught to think, not to feel. And to add a quick tangent, we've also become addicted to our phones and a constant stream of information that is not helping with us getting more in tune with our bodies. But I digress. Even though your profession literally requires laws and reason to make decisions, there may be times when that gut feeling sneaks up, when something is telling you to look again or look closer or to try another angle. And if you want to get back to feeling your way through decisions, I refer back to step 1, focus on the feeling, and 2, get comfortable being uncomfortable.
It's really helpful framing, Claire. Thank you. So next we have Exhibit D, and I realize as the host, I've done a poor job of calling out each exhibit, but I promise this is Exhibit D. This is the title that I have for this one based on our prep is The Decisions That Changed Everything. Because I hear you making the case for listening to your gut and you've backed it up with concepts and different tools. But I think ultimately for a lot of people who are listening, it's going to come down to the proof that it works. And I think it's important to have you here today making this case because you didn't just learn about this as a concept. You've lived it. You've applied it. The results of listening to your gut are, in fact, the life you're living right now. As you've explained, you left a relationship that wasn't right for you. You moved out of Hoboken in New York City. I think you moved to Pittsburgh on your own. You met your partner. You bought your first home. You left a corporate job to build your own business. Every single one of these things, from how you've described it, was based on a gut decision, listening to your gut. So can you kind of walk us through the thread? You don't need to go into each one of them in detail unless you'd like to, but maybe the ones that were hardest, the ones where your gut said, don't do this, but everything else said, you have to do this.
Of what you mentioned, the strongest example was leaving my relationship, which of course was the big gut decision that fed into learning how to make all of these other decisions. My last relationship, which I have spoken on a little bit, what that was like for me. And for someone listening, you may be thinking, it was so obvious you were unhappy, so why didn't you leave? Neither one of us knew that relationships could get better than what we had because we had no proof from the adults in our lives. So, despite how unhappy I felt, I stayed because there was enough good stuff and because, as someone who relied on external validation, I had someone who loved me and regularly reminded me that in some ways I was enough. I mentioned earlier that my dad spent so much time trying to be enough for others that he forgot how to be enough for himself, and that was me too. I wanted so much to be enough for my ex-boyfriend, from becoming hyper aware of how much I talked and how I acted around other people, especially around his family, to offering to convert to his religion. But still, it never felt like it was actually enough because I wasn't being an authentic version of myself. And all of it, every day, fighting with what I thought would be the right thing versus who I really was, only served to demolish my already low self-esteem even further. Throughout the course of the relationship, I probably tried to break up with him no less than 10 times because there was that little voice in my head telling me that I deserved better, that I could be happier. But until I learned to listen to that voice, I lacked the confidence to own my decision. It was only when I accepted the responsibility I had over my happiness that I was able to know definitively that that relationship was not for me. I've described that breaking point as feeling as if I was going to suffocate under the weight of trying to shape myself to please him if I stayed a second longer. And the moment that I understood that, there was absolutely no question that I was ready to walk away. And the moment I did, that weight was lifted off of my shoulders. Leaving the relationship naturally led to me also leaving Hoboken. And now I will give you a great example of when the answer is yes, the puzzle pieces just fall together. When I worked in New York, I worked for a global architecture firm as a sustainability specialist. I chose to move to Pittsburgh, despite only visiting once 2 months before I moved, because I could transfer to the office here and keep my job. It helped that I knew people in the Pittsburgh office. I'd already worked with them. And one person had at one point previously told me that if I ever wanted to leave New York, I should consider Pittsburgh. In moving, I met my now partner because he is an architect at the firm's Pittsburgh office. I was now in a city with a significantly lower cost of living and was able to find a very reasonable first home and make my dream of becoming a homeowner true at 26. And with a partner who is actually unconditionally supportive and loving, I had the opportunity to take a leap of faith, leaving behind the corporate world where I never quite felt like I fit, and take even more responsibility for my happiness and my life by becoming my own boss. All of these decisions were scary, but I have never felt so happy, confident, in love, and excited by my life as I do in this phase, in this stage, in this new era. And I'm so glad that I learned how to listen to my gut and to be the creator of my reality.
So, Claire, I'm listening to you describe these decisions, and I can't help it, but I'm thinking about what your dad would say if he could see the life you've built. Because everything that you just described, leaving the relationship, moving to a new city alone, building something that made you truly happy on your own terms, those are decisions for anyone that require an enormous amount of self-trust. And that is something that you said your dad struggled with. And here you are, his daughter, doing the thing he could not do. Not as I don't see that as a rejection of him, but rather I see it as an extension of the things that he taught you, even through his pain. Do you see it that way?
I entirely see it as an extension of him. It's both what he taught me directly and indirectly that have shaped where I am now. He taught me so many useful tools to be successful. If he hadn't imparted on me the importance of professional connections, I wouldn't have gotten my job in New York, so I wouldn't have ended up in Pittsburgh or meeting my partner or buying my house or leaving my job, and I wouldn't be a guest on your podcast today. He also indirectly taught me what the cost of not following your passions is, what the cost of building a life to please others rather than yourself is. And now I was able to recognize his patterns in myself and learn how to use all of the tools he taught me for my own version of success, not one determined by others, but one rooted in trust of myself. I also would be remiss to not take a moment here to acknowledge my mom, because without her, I may not have been able to take my dad's death and turn it into a learning experience. After his death, she was incredibly open with my brother and me about his struggles. We've talked a lot about how it affected his decision, and ultimately, I was able to see where his influence was showing up in my behaviors. The why behind what I do is because while I can't go back and change the way my dad viewed himself or his success, I can help myself and others reconnect to our confidence, our self-worth, and our happiness, to stop imagining a better life and to start creating it.
That's incredibly beautiful, and I'm really glad you took a moment and mentioned your mom. I got to know your mom very casually through the time around your dad's passing, and I heard her speak at um, a kind of a legacy moment that the firm had in your dad's honor, and I just remember thinking, you and your brother were there, your mom was speaking, and I just remember thinking, you know, obviously there was a lot of sadness hanging in the air at that time, but I just remember thinking for you and your brother, I could hear the strength in your mom's voice and her words and how she spoke about your dad and your family and you and your brother, and just thinking, I had my son who's now 16 was, I think he would have been 6 or 7 years old around this time. And I just remember thinking about him, but realizing from what I could tell that you and your brother were going to be okay because your mom was going to make sure that you were, and that she wasn't going to shy away from talking about your dad and his successes and his struggles because she spoke about them so openly that at that time. I just remember thinking she is going to use this as a way to help her kids understand kind of this cycle and help them avoid maybe some of the things that your dad struggled with. And I think you sitting here today talking to me about that just shows is that's the evidence of the fact that your mom was successful in doing that. So,
Yeah.
um, Claire, we've reached the point of the episode where I will give a few objections. What I try to do is take what I think listeners that are following along and listening to the case and might say, hey, Claire, like this all sounds great, but I have some concerns or I have some issues. So the first one would be, someone's listening and they're thinking, my gut has been wrong before. I've made impulsive decisions that I thought were my instincts and they turned out to be terrible. So how do you distinguish between someone's genuine gut intuition and impulsivity or fear dressed up as an instinct?
Impulsivity and fear will be just that, impulsive. That if you don't act right this second, you are going to lose this opportunity. You have to drop everything you're doing to figure out how to make this work. It's driven by anxiety. And I have had my fair share of thinking I needed something because I felt drawn to it, only to realize after that it's just shiny object syndrome. Instinct, intuition is calm. It can be exciting and fun, but it won't be demanding of you. You can act on it in your own time and the results will still be there. If you need more than the feeling to know, a good way to check in with yourself is to ask, what is driving this decision? If it's driven by external referencing or validation because you want it to look good for others or to make an impression or because you think that this thing will give you value, it's probably impulse. If it's driven by an internal pull to satisfy an internal need, it's more likely to be intuition.
That's a really important distinction. I think a lot of people, myself included, have had the experience of acting on what they felt like was instinct, and then you get burned. And that experience then makes them trust their gut even less. So understanding that difference between a genuine signal and a reactive impulse, I think, is very critical. And it's a distinction that I think anybody listening who's going to finish this episode and say, you know what, I'm going to try listening to my gut, I would hope that they might go back and listen to what you just laid out because they look a lot alike. But obviously, you got to kind of dial back down to the source and figure out, like, who's this for? Is this for the world or is this for me? So the second objection that I have, Claire, and this one I think is really important given the depth of what we've talked about today. Somebody might be listening who recognizes themselves in your dad's story, who has been making decisions for everyone else, who's been performing, who feels that dissonance you described between the life that the world sees and the life that they're actually living. And they might be thinking, it's too late for me. I'm too deep into this life. I built my life around the wrong signals and I can't undo it. So what would you say to that person?
It all depends on you to even have the awareness that you can recognize yourself in my dad's story or that something in your life is ready for change. That awareness is more than most people have. Your life will change the moment you decide you're ready to change it. It doesn't matter if you're 18, 25, 48, or 72. What matters is that you decided to start listening to what you really want. And if you're open to the possibility, some really amazing things could start to present themselves to you as you continue to open your awareness more and more. Part of gut instinct is being willing to trust the process. No matter what, please be kind to the version of yourself that was performing. In some ways, this was a survival technique, and you did the best with what you knew at the time.
I want to add something to that, Claire, because I think if your dad could hear this conversation, he would want the person who recognizes themselves in his story to know that that struggle, it's not a character flaw, right? Going back to your comment just now about be kind to that person. It's not a weakness. It's a pattern. And patterns, as you've pointed out here today, can be interrupted. Your dad was a good man. He was kind. He was a man who made the people around him, including myself, feel valued. But he was also a man who was in a lot of pain. And all of those things can be true. I think one of the most important things that this conversation does is it allows us to hold both of those truths at the same time without letting one override or cancel the other one out. So, Claire, next we're going to move to closing arguments. I'm going to ask you to go first. At this part of the episode, I ask our guest to please speak to whoever's listening right now. Maybe it's somebody who has been making every decision in their life for someone else. Maybe it's somebody who feels the dissonance that you described. Maybe it's someone who's lost someone the way that you lost your dad and they're trying to make sense of it. What do you want people listening today to carry with them after they finish this episode?
I lost my dad to suicide when I was 18 and 1 month into college. I have said this sentence so many times to myself and to others in the last 9 years that I've almost become numb to the gravity of it. At the time of his death, there was no question that my dad was a successful man. He was the chief marketing officer of Freeborn and Peters. He had the titles, the salary, the awards, and the material possessions that go along with the idealized definition of success. The only person who questioned his accomplishments was himself. Despite the public mask of perfection, fulfillment, and accomplishment, for my dad, nothing was ever good enough. He was never good enough because he relied on things outside of himself to set the standard. He lacked all sense of intrinsic worth and was unable to recognize his own value. And for a long time, I carried the same patterns until I came to recognize the impact his death could have on my life. I could choose to continue on as he did, and honestly, probably end up in a very similar or nearly as severe position, or I could choose to learn from him and take responsibility for my choices, my happiness, and my life. At 25, I learned how to stop acting for others and to start acting for myself, to listen to my gut, to my intuition, and to make choices that felt good rather than the ones that looked good. In making this shift, I left a bad relationship. I moved to a new city, met the man I'm actually going to marry, bought my first house, and have left the corporate world behind in pursuit of entrepreneurship. All in the last 2 years since. All because I started to trust in myself. We are all capable of so much more than we give ourselves credit for. If you feel like you've been living a life that's been predetermined for you by ideas of success or the influence of others, or you spend more time dreaming about a life where you're happy than actually feeling happy where you are now, this is your sign. This is your body, your intuition, your nervous system, your gut telling you that you are meant for more. It's time to listen to your gut. It's time to trust in yourself.
Well said, Claire. That is a wonderful closing statement. I have my own, and I'm fearful that as the lawyer on the episode, you're going to show me up with yours, but I'm going to do my best. So what I want to say is it's focused on your dad. For many years, I shared a wall with your dad. And admittedly, I've thought about him more in the years since he's been gone than I did when he was right there on the other side of that wall, which I think in and of itself is its own kind of lesson about paying attention to the people in front of you while they're still in front of you. What I remember about your dad is warmth. I remember a man who made people feel good, who made a law firm feel a little bit more human than law firms generally feel, and someone who had time for you even when he didn't really have time. What I learned from you today, Claire, is that the same qualities that made your dad so generous with others, his attentiveness, his need to make sure that everyone else was okay, came at the cost of his own inner voice. Your dad was so focused on the signal from the room that he lost that signal from himself. I will never pretend to know what your dad was carrying. I only know what I saw, which was kindness. And I know what his daughter has built from his legacy, which is a life centered on the exact things that your dad struggled with himself, which is trusting in himself. So if you're listening to this and you recognize yourself in any part of this conversation, if you've been making decisions for the room you're in instead of for yourself, if the life the world sees is different from the life you're living, or if you've been overriding the signal from your gut because the spreadsheet says something different, I really want you to hear what Claire's saying today. The signal, it's still there. It has not given up on you. It's patient. And the first step is not an absolute revolution. It's a pause, a moment where you stop analyzing and start allowing yourself to feel. And you ask yourself, honestly, in the quiet, does this feel right? That question, while it could be viewed as vague, is not soft. It's not abstract. It's actually the hardest question that most of us will ever have to sit with, because the honest answer might require change, and change for anyone is terrifying. But that alternative, the alternative of a life spent performing for a room that doesn't go home with you, you deserve better than that. Ian deserved better than that. And the fact that his daughter is sitting here today building a life on the principle he couldn't access means that his story is not just a tragedy, but it's a beginning. So I hope that anybody listening takes Claire's advice and listens to your gut, because it has been talking to you this whole time. So Claire, the next thing we're going to do now that we've rested our case is I like to give anyone who's listening some micro tools. I think you've touched on some things so far in some of your comments, but I want to let our listeners have something that they can take with them out into the world, assuming they're going to start listening to their gut a little bit more affirmatively. So I want you to go first. Give us one practice, Claire, something simple, something that somebody can do this week to start reconnecting with their gut, something from your yoga and embodiment work that helps people begin hearing that internal signal again.
Go outside without your phone. It doesn't matter if you live in an urban area or more rural. Go outside, find a comfortable place to sit, and just observe. Observe the people around you. Listen for the birds in the trees. Feel the wind go by, and allow yourself to exist in that moment. Thoughts may come up. Emotions may come up. The goal, if you need one, is to be present with all of it. Learning to be present will allow you to become more receptive to the gut feelings.
That's very beautiful, Claire. Here's my micro tool. So this week, before you make a decision, any decision, small, medium, large, pause for 5 seconds and ask yourself a single question. How does this feel in my body? Not what does the logic or the analysis say, not what will people think if I do this, but how does it feel? And you don't have to act on the answer, not yet. Just notice it. Start paying attention to the signal that you've been overriding, because in my experience, my gut doesn't speak in evidence or arguments. It speaks in sensations or waves. And if you've been living in your head for 20 or 30 or 40 years, those sensations, they're still there, but they're probably faint. So what I would say is the more you pay attention, the louder they're going to get, and the more you're going to trust those instincts. And so reflect on those things. Don't act this week. Just take that time, reflect, and make sure you ask yourself those questions. So Claire, where we've reached the end of the episode, I'm really, really glad that we had this conversation. Before we let you go, where can people who want to learn more about you or reach out to you find you? Tell us about your work and how listeners can connect with you.
The best place to find me right now is on Instagram. You can search for my name, Claire Turvill, and Embrace and Flow Collective, which is at Embrace Flow CLTV. Or if Instagram is not your thing, I am on LinkedIn. If you happen to be in Pittsburgh, I teach yoga privately. If you're not in Pittsburgh, I offer mentoring on everything we've discussed in this episode to help you actually create the life you've always been dreaming of. I will also come lead your next corporate wellness event or leadership retreat if you're looking for someone who has that corporate experience and you're looking to blend movement, creativity, and connection for your employees. Please reach out. I'd love to connect with anyone who has listened to this, even just to say hi, and especially if you knew my dad.
Claire, thank you for this conversation, for being honest and vulnerable, for honoring your dad's memory by building something real from something painful. I know your dad would be incredibly proud of you if he could see you and listen to you speak today. Thank you so much for the vulnerability and the authenticity today. Like, this has been maybe my favorite episode I've ever recorded of the podcast.
Thank you so much. And thank you for giving me a space to reconnect with my dad and to share his story more broadly.
To those of you listening, that is our case for today. If this episode landed with you, if you recognized yourself in any part of Claire's story or Ian's, please reach out, post with hashtag the case for, and tell us, when was the last time you listened to your gut and what happened when you did? And when was the last time you ignored it and what did that cost you? And lastly, I want to say that if you or someone you know is struggling with mental health, please reach out. You are not alone. The 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is available 24/7, and you can call or text 988. Thank you so much, Claire, for being here. To the listeners, thanks for tuning in. And remember, whatever your case is, don't be afraid to build it and carry it out into the real world.